Good morning, everyone. My name is Connie and I'm the Director of NZ International Tax and Property Advisors. Welcome to the final webinar, Strategies to Combat Interest Limitation on Commercial Investment. We've got lots of exciting materials, so stay tuned. Feel free to post your queries during the webinar and we'll endeavour to answer all queries at the end of the webinar. We're stoked to have Alistair and Bibiana and Blandon again. So Alistair is the Director of Macrae Property Brokers. Bibiana is the partner of the Leung law firm, and Blandon, the director of MHQ Mortgage Advisors, to talk to us about commercial investments today. First up, I'll talk about the new interest limitation rule and the commercial property exemption and other tax advantages for commercial property investment over residential property investment. Then we have Alistair to talk about what to look for in a good commercial property. Then we have Bibiana who goes through property law and regulations for commercial property. And lastly, we have Blandon to talk about financing for commercial property and how to leverage equity in your existing property portfolio. So I'll start with the new interest limitation rule, the inclusion and exclusion, other tax advantages for commercial properties, investment, available ownership structure to buy commercial properties, and the pros and cons of different ownership structure. And lastly, I'll finish off with a case study. Before I dive further, I'd like to share how I crossed paths with the property industry. So I grew up in a household where my family talked about issues they're having with their commercial and residential property investments. Their property investments were in residential and commercial, and I gained experience from helping my family with managing their property portfolio. And again, this is repeating to those who haven't actually attended our previous two webinars, just a brief introduction of myself. So I kind of did that after graduating from University of Auckland with a Bachelor of Commerce, conjoined with Bachelor of Property and Master of Taxation Studies degree. And over the last 10 years, I observed how issues were addressed and how risks were minimized, and gained a wealth of commercial and residential property consulting experience while working as a full-time tax accountant. I started investing in both commercial and residential property in my mid-20s after graduating and saved funds for a deposit after working for a few years. So a bit about my background. So while investing in both residential and commercial properties, I worked as a full-time tax consultant at a big four mid-tier chartered accountant firms. I've lectured tax at University in Auckland and helped my family with their residential and commercial property investments. I'm a chartered accountant and I started my own firm last year. So we're a one-stop chartered accountant firm specializing in property tax and consulting, cross-border tax for migrants, ID disputes and resolution, and SME tax. Our clients are property developers, property investors, SMEs, expats, and migrants. Just thought it's quite useful to summarize what's included and excluded from the new interest limitation rule as a start. So the new interest limitation rule only applies to the residential short and long-term accommodation and doesn't include commercial property. So interest on that is incurred in holding commercial property are still deductible. And another few interesting exclusion that is that includes land outside New Zealand, and we've covered new builds and residential property development in the past webinars. And other exclusion include employee accommodation, farmland, care facility, commercial accommodation, retirement villages, and rest home and business premises. Here are some other tax advantages for investing in commercial property. So we've talked about how interest continued to be deductible. Whereas for residential, if you've got existing property, if you had hold the property before the end of March this year, then you would have that phase out, that grandparented interest deduction, and that's phased out over 4 years, which we talked about in a new bill webinar. So I won't repeat that in more detail. And if you purchase a property after an end of March, then it will not be deductible from the 1st of October. And then you've got the depreciation on building that is still is now reintroduced. which I'll talk further in the next few slides. So that's depreciation on building for commercial. It is still deductible now, but for residential, that's not. Because the depreciation rate on residential is 0%. There's no bright line test, so if you buy and sell in a commercial property, it might not be, so it's not subject to that bright line test, but then we also need to consider whether other land taxing provision applies. But then we know that for the residential, there is that bright line test there. And with the residential land withholding tax, it doesn't apply to commercial, and because the residential land withholding tax is linked with the bright line test. Again, I'll go into in further details in the next few slides. Again, this is just still a summary. And also there's no ring fencing of tax losses for commercial properties investments, whereas there for losses, whereas residential there is. And in terms of claiming GST on expenses, you can register for GST and claim GST on expenses if you hold a commercial property, whereas for residential you can't, because providing residential accommodation for long term, it is a GST exempt supply. But if you are providing a short term accommodation, residential accommodation, like Airbnb, that can potentially be a GST taxable supply, and therefore you may have to register for GST. So the GST treatment for long term and short term residential accommodations are different. Okay, so starting off with the depreciation for commercial property. So almost 10 years ago, the depreciation rate on commercial building was reduced to 0%. So this has been reintroduced as part of the COVID relief package and was effective from the 1st of April 2020. Depreciation is calculated based on the cost of the building, and the cost consists of the purchase price and any capital improvements made up to the 1st of April 2020. So say landlords should ensure like all the non-deductible capital expenditure are captured in the cost base to maximize the depreciation deduction. So this might include seismic strengthening work or improvement work for commercial buildings. As an example, say if you have a commercial property with a 600,000 cost base, this can result in around 12,000 of non-cash tax deductions, because you go 60,000 times say 2% diminishing value, that will be around 12,000 non-cash deduction. And the resulting tax saving is around $3,000 to $4,000 per year, depending on the taxpayer's tax rate. So whether you're having whether the property is owned by a company, which is at 28%, or a trust, which could be at 33%, or in your personal name, again, depending on what sort of level of income you're receiving for that year. As I mentioned, the bright line test is linked with the residential land withholding tax. So residential land withholding tax applies where disposal of residential land located in New Zealand, and that is taxable income under the bright line test, and the vendor is an offshore residential land withholding tax person. As bright line test doesn't apply to commercial property, residential land withholding tax should not apply. So this means that if an offshore vendor do not need to withhold tax on the sale of the commercial property if they buy and sell within that bright line test period, and now it is 10 years with the recent changes. Next, we've got ring fencing of tax losses, which came into effect from the 1st of April 2019. The effect of these, the ring fencing of tax losses rule is that the losses incurred from the residential rental property cannot offset against other types of income, such as salary or business income, but is carried forward to future income years to offset against future taxable rental income or any proceeds from taxable land sale. Again, these rules doesn't apply to commercial property. What this means is that tax losses incurred from commercial property can offset against other income like salary and potentially future PAYE tax refund. Moving on to GST, landlords needs to consider the level of the commercial rental he or she receives or likely to receive to determine whether he or she is required to register GST for the entity that owns the commercial property. So if over 60,000 of commercial rental has been received in any 12-month period, then the commercial landlord needs to register for GST. If it's under 60,000 commercial rental, then the commercial landlord are not required to register for GST, but they can voluntarily do so if they wish to. And some tax benefit for registering for GST is potential zero rating on land transaction and the claim of the GST on expenses. Well, of course, the GST on commercial rental needs to be returned as well to the IRD. So here are various ownership structure that can own commercial property. So to determine which is most appropriate for the taxpayer, it is case by case, and the taxpayers' long-term and short-term personal and business goals should be considered. Also, the cost-benefit should also be weighed up to see if setting up that structure is worthwhile. So, say if the cost of setting it up and the ongoing compliance cost outweighs the benefit, then maybe there's no point setting up the structure and just having it in your personal name, being more simpler and more cost effective. So there are pros and cons to each of these structure. So for personal, the benefit is that there's less compliance and administration because you only need to file an income tax return, so IR3, and there's no setup cost at the upfront. However, asset and property is not well protected as compared to, say, a trust. In terms of look-through company, it is taxed at the marginal tax rate instead of the flat 28% tax rate. So if you've got income that is lower than, say, 70,000, the average effective tax rate would be lower than the 28%. And that's why I put it as a benefit. The look-through company still has a limited liability protection. And so that's another benefit of the look-through company. With the cons there would be the additional compliance with the having to prepare financial statement and prepare tax return for a separate entity within the look-through company, and also set up costs. And then election also needs to be made to the IRD to elect the ordinary company to become a look-through company. And in terms of the ordinary company, the benefit here is that the tax rate is 28%, so it may be better for higher income earners, because currently the highest personal tax rate is at 39%, right? So there's already that tax savings there with the differential. And again, limited liability protection for ordinary company. And the cons is that you can't really distribute capital gains until the ordinary company is wound up, because during the existence of a company, any transfer of value from the company to the shareholder, it's likely to be treated as a dividend, and that is taxable. So unless you wound up, and in order to get if you've got any capital gains in that ordinary company and trying to get it out, winding up is one of the options there. There's the trust, and the benefit of having a trust, there's a few here. We've got asset protection, estate planning, share of the trust income with beneficiary, and distributing capital gains tax-free without having to wound up. And the cons here is that there is additional compliance, especially with the recent change in trust law at the beginning of this year. There's additional compliance and disclosure, so that could add to the cost. So if you wish to explore this option, you can speak to Bibiana, who can help and its experience in this area. Just wanted to, I think, end up with a finish off with a case study. So we've got, say, Mr. Brown, who owns 14 residential houses and start to diversify his portfolio with buying commercial property. In the past 2 years, he purchased 4 commercial industrial property, and he's contemplating selling more to invest in commercial. So what we will look at is, okay, from the tax point of view, these would be some pre-acquisition considerations. So has he got the right ownership structure? So we've got the trust, look-through company, ordinary company that we can consider. So we need to consider Mr. Brown's short and long-term personal business goals. Say, for instance, if Mr. Brown has children who are older than 16 years old, having a trust would allow the flexibility to share the income with the children's at Mr. Brown's discretion every year. So that would reduce the overall tax liability. And Mr. Brown may also wish to create a separate entity for residential properties and commercial property due to the difference in the risk level. Commercial property tend to have a higher risk because of you're dealing with commercial tenants. However, having 2 entities does come with additional compliance costs. So again, going back to the cost-benefit analysis, is it worthwhile having that a separate entity for the commercial properties? Some other tax consideration during the holding period would be that we can continue to depreciate commercial properties on the 4 commercial property that he holds, but not for the 14 residential properties. Any commercial rental tax losses can offset against Mr. Brown's salary if he has any, which may result in a tax refund. And also leasing out a commercial property is a GST taxable activity. So Mr. Brown can claim GST input tax credit on the purchases, such as leasing commissions and marketing costs. If you wish to consider transitioning from residential to commercial property investment, you can speak to Alistair, who can help with finding good commercial property stock for you, and Blandon, who can advise how to leverage the equity in the residential property portfolio and to buy commercial properties. Some tax considerations upon sale is that commercial properties are not subject to the bright line test. So if Mr. Brown decides to sell one of the 4 commercial property in, say, 2 years' time, it may not be taxable, whereas proceeds from the sale of the residential property is still taxable if it's purchased and sold within 10 years now. And for residential land withholding tax, it doesn't apply to the sale of commercial property, whereas it may apply to residential property because of the bright line test if it applies. So here are some services we can assist with. We offer a free 15-minute consultation for new clients. We provide property tax compliance and consulting. We specialize in the area of cross-border property tax. We can also provide written and verbal tax advice. If you'd like to know more about us, you can go on our website, nztaxprop.co.nz. Before I pass you on to the next speaker, I will just share a gift for those who did not attend our previous webinar. So helpful guide for your next property purchase. As mentioned, feel free to post your queries in the chat box and I'll respond at the end of the webinar. If you wish to contact me, you've got my contact details on the slide. I'll hand you over to Alistair, who will talk about what to look for in a good commercial property. Over to you, Alistair. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie. Morning, everyone. I see a few less people than we had the other day, but that's understandable given the sun's out. Yeah, look, some good points by Connie. Obviously, there's some pretty big differences between resi and commercial when it comes to tax, each having their own benefits. I would just say it's important to get the ownership structure the best fit for you up front before you start buying. So I'm director and one of the co-owners of Macrae Property Brokers. We're a boutique commercial brokers in South Auckland, but we also do dabble in resi, mainly off-market or sourcing investment properties or development sites. My background, I'm not your typical real estate salesperson. I'm actually a civil engineer by background and spent several years in a mergers and acquisitions type role for a large firm, buying and selling at big assets and businesses. Now, what's your property wealth strategy? And Blandon will talk to this. So Blandon helps you develop your strategy along with your financial advisor like Connie. But once you've got your strategy defined, you really need to understand what your risk profile is, what type of property, size property, location of property, return fundamentals best suit your risk profile and objectives. And do you need to diversify your portfolio? I guess we've seen a lot of clients transition from resi to commercial just this last couple of years. Most of them Auckland-based investors, and their rationale, it's usually because they've built up a fair bit of equity in the price run in their resi portfolio, and they want to leverage that, but they don't necessarily want to buy more houses, so they turn to commercial. Or it may be resi investors thinking that the market might be topping and they just want to take a bit of money off the table and roll it into something else and just diversify their investment portfolio. Now, don't be scared of commercial property. It's not rocket science. It really is quite straightforward, and there's a lot of great materials freely available on the internet. You definitely do not need to be a super wealthy investor and know certain people to invest successfully in commercial property. It's full of mum and dads and small investors. There's anything and everything out there that runs from a few $100,000 to millions, tens of millions, etc. So understanding your objectives, really important up front, is don't buy the first thing that you like. Try and minimise the risk in the property that you do buy by carefully selecting the geographical area. Within that area, what's the best specific suburb? What type of property you're looking at? Are you looking at industrial, commercial, retail? Have a really good look at the lease agreement, etc. So there's a lot of risks associated with commercial property ownership that you can actually mitigate on day one before you actually buy the property. And what is commercial property? I mean, it's probably teaching most people how to suck eggs, but basically you've got offices, retail shops and industrial. Now, in the last couple of years, the office market was already slightly declining just simply due to technology and reducing workforces in businesses. More recently with COVID, working from home has hit the sector relatively hard. There's a lot of empty office space around Auckland and throughout the country, but doesn't mean that there's not good investments out there. And if anything, if you pick and choose right, you can actually make some pretty good money. We've got one at the moment, for example, it's got a government tenant in there for 20 years, and that's looking like it's probably going to sell for a 6.5% return, whereas pre-COVID, it would have been a lot lower. Retail, if you're going to buy retail, I think there's a lot of really good opportunities in retail now, post-COVID. A lot of people are scared of retail because it did get a little bit of a hit, but I think the good opportunities in retail are buying largish floor area size properties in really strongly located streets within suburbs and looking to potentially divide it into one or two tenancies. For example, my local Browns Bay, there's some massive empty retail tenancies of 200, 300, 400 square metres, and they're just too big for the market now. So buying something like that and seeing if you can split it up, you can really add a lot of value. And industrials are really, really strong. It's literally the strongest it's ever been on record in Auckland and New Zealand. So vacancy rates in industrial are below 1 or 2% in Auckland, which is just incredibly, incredibly tight. And it's not just from property investors driving prices up, but it's supply and demand fundamentals for tenants as well. So the market in industrial now, from a tenant demand point of view, I'd say is noticeably tighter than pre-COVID. And it's simply because demand is exceeding supply. There's not enough new industrial property coming onto the market. And that's been reflected in really strong price growth and really strong asset value growth. Resi versus commercial. So yeah, they're very different risk profiles. So they've got different return profiles. And I've just got a couple of slides here to note the key differences between the two asset classes. So everyone's familiar with resi. It's usually 6 to 12 month leases. You usually cut a new lease after 12 months. It's unusual to see one longer. Commercial, typically 3 to 15 years. And at the smaller end of town, you tend to see shorter leases around that 3 to 6 year mark. But obviously it comes with some benefits. If you can lock in a tenant for 3 to 6 years and then just not touch it, it's a great hands-off investment. And that's why a lot of people love them. Everything's negotiable in commercial. Resi, you've got your standard off-the-shelf contract, but with commercial, well, we do have off-the-shelf contracts published by the Real Estate Institute in New Zealand and the Auckland District Law Society. You can negotiate them to be whatever you want them to be, as long as it's not illegal. Vacancy risk. So resi, it's usually pretty easy to release your house. Commercial, depending on the property and the location and where that sector in the economy is at, it can take anywhere from weeks to months. So this is where I'm coming from, where select the property well up front. You know, if you're new to the market, don't chase super high yields, because super high yields usually equals higher risk. And while you've got a tenant in there for 3 years, in 3 years' time, you know, it might take a few months or several months to release that property. So minimise that risk up front with choosing a location and a property that will always be in strong demand. Yields, resi, after all your ownership costs, you're usually looking at 2 to 3% net in the pocket. Commercial, 4%, up to 10%, depending on location. Yields have compressed a lot in the last couple of years with the low interest rate environment, but you can pick up some pretty decent properties in the 4 to 5% range, and that's net after expenses. One of the main differences between resi and commercial, resi, you collect your rent and then pay for everything else as the owner. Commercial properties are set up so that they are, the rent that you charge the tenant is the rent that goes in your pocket, and all of the ownership expenses get paid by the tenant. You pass them through at cost through the lease, which is a great benefit. And particularly, there's a lot of, we still come across landlords that aren't aware that they can pass their property management fees through. So with resi, your headline property management fees usually 7%, 8%, but then they add on all those monthly disbursements, and you're usually paying 10% of rent in your property management costs, and that's yours to pay. Commercial, depending on the property, you're looking at anywhere from 2.5% to 4 or 5% of your rent as a property management fee. And with the new form lease agreements, the tenant actually pays that. You pass it through to the tenant. And if anyone on the line is already owning commercial property and paying more than 5% in property management fees, you're definitely paying too much. You don't hire a resi agent to manage your commercial property. They'll charge you too much and they won't do as good a job. Blandon will get on to deposits. You do need a higher deposit in commercial, 35%, but don't let that rule it out for you. Blandon's going to share some great solutions on accessing equity in resi and showing how to roll it into commercial and leverage the higher net returns in commercial. Tax benefits. Yeah, there's some really good tax benefits in commercial. The reintroduction of depreciating the buildings is a really good one. It doesn't sound like much at 1.5%, 2%, but when you capitalise that over the term of the investment, it really does add to your internal rate of return on your capital. Yield. So in the resi world, whenever you're reading in the papers and the news, yield is always gross yield. It's the rent you collect from the tenant divided by what you paid for the property. Commercial, whenever we talk yield, it's always net yield. It's the yield the owner receives in their pocket after all the expenses. And the yield of the property, it reflects risk and return. You know, the higher the yield, the higher the risk, typically. But yield also reflects capital gains potential. It may reflect the future maintenance or capital expenditure required on the property. tenant risk, etc., etc. And I've just talked that through. Low interest rates, look, it's a fantastic opportunity. I think it's a once in generational opportunity at the moment with the low interest rate environment. We've never seen it before. New Zealand Reserve Bank's only just stopped printing money, let alone dropping interest rates down to the lowest they've ever been. I think interest rates will probably tick up a little bit, but they might stay flat thereafter once some temporary inflation in the global supply chain stabilises. And we always talk about Auckland, and there's a simple reason being, you know, it's the largest city market in New Zealand by far. It's always had the strongest population growth rate. And what I particularly like about it is it's the lowest risk city in New Zealand from a seismic point of view. And just to demonstrate the differences, these are actual examples from about 6-12 months ago. So we've got a resi house, buy it for 800,000, rent it for 660 a week, which is probably on the highish side for a decent property. Pay all your council rates, insurance, maintenance, management expenses, etc., etc. After you've paid for all those ownership costs, you're netting 3.4%. Commercial property tenanted at 48,000 a year, so you'll know the rent's a bit higher as well. But all these ownership costs get passed through at cost to the tenant. Net result being, well, the rent you charge the tenant's what you receive, and you're making 6% per annum on that property. So it's a pretty significant difference in the net cash flow characteristics. But again, like I said, just because the commercial property has the higher rate of return doesn't necessarily mean it's a better investment than resi property. It all comes down to your personal risk profile and investment objectives. And I'm just going to run through a couple of quick examples, and I've intentionally chosen a couple of industrial ones now because it's all people want to know about these days. So I've got two here, actual examples from the last 6-12 months. So we've got the industrial unit in Wiri, South Auckland. Now, with industrial units, they are literally usually concrete walled boxes with a tin metal roof and a little office space. And they're very straightforward. So, I mean, with houses, people tend to not like old ones because they come with, you know, significant renovation costs after 10, 15 years, etc. Industrial properties, not so much. People just want a high ceiling height or stud height, as we call it, space with a little bit of office space, kitchen, bathroom. So here's one that's 361 square metres floor area, 1980s build. You know, it was okay condition. Buyer bought it, 1.07. At the time, it was renting for 50,000 a year. They picked it up at a net yield of 4.6%, which at face value, yeah, it's not too bad. These guys bought pretty well at the time. A lot of investors would just hang on to it at that level. But these guys, the tenant vacated the property. They spent $100,000 doing it up, and that is literally just a lick of paint on the walls and the ceiling, put some LED lights in, new carpet flooring, and some moderate quality fixtures, fittings in the bathroom, kitchen, and that's literally it. They may or may not epoxy coat the concrete floor in the warehouse. Having spent that money, simply because it just looks better, it looks nicer, it's human nature. People just like things that look better. Where it sat in the market after that was $65,000 a year rental. So they'd lifted their net yield from 4.6% to 5.5% for outlaying just an extra 10%, an extra 100 grand. Now, this investor, what they actually did was put it on the market. So they added the value, they renovated it, lifted the rent. Now, if they were to sell it at the same yield they bought it for, 4.6%, in theory, they'd be asking for 1.4 million for it. But the upgrade, you know, it lifted its profile in the marketplace. So people saw it once it was tenanted as a low risk property with a tenant, fresh tenant on a fresh lease. Nothing needs to be spent on it. It's only just been done up. Actually sold for a 4.3% yield. So they bought this property for 1.07 million, spent 100 grand, 1.17. and then flipped it on for 1.5. Now, I'm not suggesting that new investors to commercial property look to flip properties like this. I'm just demonstrating that the return on dollar on buying an older property that needs a bit of work can be quite significant in rental uplift. And another quick example that's a lower budget, similar age, 1980s build. This property looked pretty ordinary internally. It was dark, the carpet was skanky, it was dirty. You know, you wouldn't use the bathroom type of thing, but they're empty shells, right? So this guy, same investor actually, I bought this one well, just a small unit. It's just a box with a 2-level office in it. Bought it for $465, and this is this year. 4.7% yield. It was renting for $22,000 a year net. This is what it looks like inside. This one's a little unusual because it's got the 2-level office all the way through to the back wall. A lot of buyers and investors would just rip that out just to maximise the work area. What you see here is the machinery that this guy is using to just prepare the concrete floor and epoxy coat it. So what they did here was literally a lick of paint on the walls, all through the offices, kitchens, etc. Epoxy coated the floor, LED lights, a couple of split aircon systems. All up, they only spent $20,000. They lifted the rental though to $28,000. Now, again, these guys look to on sell it, and I'm just again showing just the value that you can add very, very easily. So they listed it for sale or for rent at $28,500. If they were to sell it at the same yield they bought it for, they'd be selling for $606. We actually sold it for $635, and the guy that we sold it to immediately leased it literally within a week or two for $30,000 a year. So that's just a good example of how a little bit of money can add a lot of value for rental. And again, not suggesting that you flip properties, but it doesn't take much to lift the rent in the market. If you buy something that's just dirty and old, doesn't mean it's bad. If there's nothing structurally wrong with it, you know, just clean it up, high pressure water hose it, give it a lick of paint. And the same applies for retail. Some vacant retailers in Browns Bay, for example, they're struggling to lease because they're just too big and there's too many of them available. One of the owners I've noticed recently has finally realised he just needs to make his place look better than the others. So he's installed a whole bunch of LED lights and given all the walls and ceilings a lick of paint. How we can support you? Well, firstly, I'd say the best way to learn the market is just by talking to agents in general and just pick their brains. And if people aren't willing to share their knowledge with you, then you know, don't work with those guys. We can act as a buyer's agent, or we can source options. So what I've got here is property sourcing service. So our approach is to sit down with you, better understand your budget, your risk profile, your financial objectives. We don't want anyone who ever works through us to regret having done so or to regret having bought the property they've bought. We'll source options within your risk profile objectives and your budget and just set them out to you in a report. And rather than just highlighting the positives and how great this property is, our approach is to highlight, look, these are the advantages of this property, these are the disadvantages. Just be upfront about the negatives. You're going to find out anyway. And as I said, we don't want anyone to regret having bought a property. They should be long-term investments for you and do really well for your wealth building. And with that, I'll throw to Blandon, to Bibiana, sorry. Before I go to Bibiana, just a key point, Bibiana might touch on it. Buying commercial property, a really good strategy when you're buying is to push out the settlement date and to get early access. So both those properties I showed you previously, the buyer had actually already completed most of the upgrade work before they'd even settled on the property. And that's really common. So keep that in mind, and also helps with your finances as well. And with that, I'll throw to you, Bibiana.
Thank you, Alistair. Good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen. All right, everyone. My name is Bibiana, and I'm a partner at Leung Newmarket, Auckland. Today, I'm mainly going to talk to you about the differences between a commercial lease and residential lease, and about the things to watch out for when you're purchasing a commercial property. A commercial lease is rather different from a residential tenancy agreement. Commercial leases are commercial contracts. They're not governed by any legislation or laws set up by the government as such. Whereas the residential tenancies are governed by the Residential Tenancies Act, which provides very little flexibility as to the negotiations that you might have with your residential tenants. Everything is set out in stone in the Residential Tenancies Act, and you're not able to contract out of a lot of the terms. For example, outgoings in relation to a residential tenancy, rates, basically outgoings apart from water, power, internet and telephone. For a residential tenancy, everything else is payable by the landlord. So that includes maintenance of the property. Whereas with commercial leases, it's largely dependent on the terms and conditions that you agree with your tenant. More often than not, the tenant's responsible for maintenance of the property, and so if any of the chattels, fixtures within the property require maintenance, repairs, then the tenant will be responsible for it and not the landlord. Potentially with a commercial lease, you could set up the lease so that all outgoings are payable by the tenant, such that the landlord is not responsible to pay any outgoings. The only time when a landlord has to when the landlord has to cough up for outgoings is when you've got, let's say, an aircon system, chattels and fixtures belonging to the landlord can no longer be repaired or maintained, and it has to be replaced, and they are part of the landlord's chattels and fixtures. Then the landlord would have to pay for the replacement of those items, unless it is proven that the tenants damage those items. The other difference is a residential tenancy is GST exempt, but for a commercial lease, it's a commercial activity, so there's taxable supply. You would be registered for GST as such. With a commercial lease, you are leasing to a business. So quite often people will sign the agreement with the deed of lease with the name of the company. To protect yourself, you would want personal guarantee from the directors and shareholders of the company. You would want to do a credit check on on the shareholders and directors to see if they are financially secure. You may ask for a bond to secure the commercial tenancy. That part of it isn't all that different from a residential tenancy, where with a residential tenancy you lease to individuals and you still ask for bond, but with residential tenancies, there is a limitation on how much bond you can obtain, which is 4 weeks at the very most. With a commercial lease, it could be anything that's agreeable between the landlord and tenants. I've seen leases where the bond is up to a year of rent. Normally in those conditions, you know, the market is good for commercial properties, and it's prime location. The tenant isn't, you know, doesn't have any sort of financial support. And so as a form of security, the landlord requires a heftier bond. Residential property and commercial property, you know, if we normally recommend clients to engage a property manager for commercial properties, reason being, you know, depending on the kinds of commercial properties that you're buying. If it's a building with multiple tenancies, then you would want a commercial property manager to manage the property for you, because there are actually quite a lot of fish hooks as to property management. An experienced property manager will know what to do when a tenant leaves, what the market is, will be attending to apportionment of outgoings, collection of outgoings, rent. The other difference between a commercial lease and a residential tenancy lease is reinstatement of the property at the end of the tenancy. With residential tenancies, there is no reinstatement, so long as the property is left clean without any damage. With commercial tenancies, it's common. Almost always there is a clause in the deed of lease where the tenant at the end of the tenancy would have to reinstate the premises to the condition that it was. The condition that it was in when the lease commenced. So fair wear and tear accepted. Lately with commercial leases, some of you might have heard about the rent rebate that tenants are getting. Post the Christchurch earthquake, the Auckland District Law Society deed of lease have been amended. That's the most widely used form of deed of lease. It's been amended to include rights of cancellation for tenants if they're not able to access the property in a year, 9 months. And there is a clause in particular that provides that in emergency situations, including pandemics such as COVID-19, a portion of the outgoings and rent shall be deducted from the standard normal rent and outgoings. The clause doesn't provide for the amount that you should reduce the rent in those situations. So it is a matter of negotiation between the tenants and the landlord. What we've seen in the market is with retail tenancies where they can't even work from home, the business has just closed down, and landlords have afforded a higher rent rebate. I've seen up to 100%, but sort of mostly around the 70-50% mark. Whereas with offices, normally, I think in the last year and a half, the rebate that I've seen is about 50%, 30 to 50%. With what's happened in the last year, a lot of commercial landlords are now reviewing the deed of lease when they first enter into the same with the tenants. So getting clients who are wanting to have that clause deleted in its entirety. And of course, you can do that if the tenant agrees. But more often than not, I'm seeing landlords define what proportion of rent will be deducted in the event of emergency. So it's something that you'd have to pay attention to when entering into deed of lease. I'm going to move on to the issues that you'd have to look at when purchasing a commercial property. And without sounding like a broken record for those of you who attended the previous 2 webinars that I gave, you want to have your due diligence investigation sorted out before you enter into an unconditional agreement, or alternatively, you want your agreement to have a due diligence clause to enable you to look at various aspects of the property before you go ahead and buy it. With the due diligence process, it is not just about looking at the leases, the LIM report, the building report that's in front of you. A lot of times it's things that are not recorded, not in writing, that you have to pay attention to. For example, a client of mine signed up to purchase the premises for a supermarket, a rather large supermarket. On the lease, it was great, you know. The rental yield was very, very high, and the supermarket is a very, they're a big company. They're never late in rent, and it looks like at the commencement of lease, the landlord, the current landlord, has already renovated the property, but upon digging further, we found that actually there was another supermarket. The same supermarket that was just down the road, which was more popular with the local population, and there is a real likelihood that after the termination of the current term of the lease, the supermarket might not renew the lease with our client. And because the premises were renovated and fitted out to suit a supermarket, it would be difficult at the end of the lease if the supermarket refuses to renew the lease, to look for other tenants without doing a huge fit out process. So my client in that situation didn't proceed with buying the building. So definitely, apart from what's in the lease documents, you would want to know the site, as Alistair said, and you might want to do a site visit. And there are also questions that you want to ask the vendor, such as, you know, are there any legal disputes between the current landlord and the tenants? Are there any disputes between the tenants? Are there any car park disputes? That's a big one normally. Any sort of arrears, tenants who don't pay up, any unremedied breaches. You also want to know if the landlord has promised to do something and hasn't. What have they promised, and what sort of work is required, how much is involved, whether there are going to be any rent holidays that's been promised to the tenant, because without knowing all those, and when you take over when you take over the property, those will fall on your shoulders. As I've said, with commercial leases, outgoings, payment are negotiable. It could be attributed to the tenants solely, so 100% of the outgoings is payable by the tenants. So when you're buying a commercial property, apart from just looking at the rent that you will be receiving, you'd want to look at the outgoings that you'd be paying, or to phrase it another way, outgoings that are not payable by the tenants under the lease as a result of the previous commercial negotiations between the tenants and the landlord. Then together with that, you'd work out what expenses you could potentially be liable for on an annual basis for the property. So apart from the leases, you want to look at the property title to ensure that there aren't any easements, encumbrances that would affect your interest. You know, will there be a easement in favor of any neighboring property? I've come across one where the next door property is a petrol station. So they've actually allocated one area of land where underneath that piece of land they've got petrol tanks. With easements like that, you just have to bear in mind that, you know, you can't build anything, you can't have anything obstructing the area above the easement. And you'd want to make sure that there is a clause in the easement for reinstatement, particularly with petrol stations, because the tanks are contaminants, and at the end of the tenure with the petrol station, you'd want to know that there is a clause which requires them to reinstate and clear any contamination that might have happened in the reinstatement. So that's just an example. You'd also want to look at the seismic assessment that would affect your insurance. You'd get a structural report. A seismic assessment is quite different from a building report. A client of mine bought a building on Albert Street, and on the seismic report it was great. It was graded A, and but then there were structural issues. So they're quite different. They're quite different reports, and we would encourage our clients to obtain a structural report, a building report, as well as a seismic report if the vendor doesn't already have the same. And the other things to watch out for is what are the repairs, replacement, maintenance that has to be done within the short term, and what has to be done in the long term. So the fixtures that are likely to be very, very costly to landlord, if there are lifts can be quite expensive. You want to know how the lifts are functioning, how when is maintenance required, is replacement likely in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. You'd also be looking at aircon system, whether they're individual units or an entire system. And again, like with lifts, those are quite expensive to replace if you are going to have to do them in the long or short term. You get a report from the maintenance people and work out what sort of expenses you're likely to face with in the long and short term. If You'd also look at the Lim report, much like a residential property purchase, and in the Lim report, there will be a whole list of building consents, code compliance, certificate application belonging to the tenant. So under a commercial lease, it is the tenant's responsibility to obtain appropriate consents if they were to do any renovations. So you'd be looking at those things which tenants' consent have been granted, and which tenant hasn't been, and what sort of enforcement you'd have to do when you take over the lease. Ideally, once you've done all your due diligence investigations, you put down a list, go back to the vendor and say that these are the issues I've found out about the property. Are you able to remedy them? If they're not able to remedy them, then you have to consider what sort of expenses you are going to be liable for, and then perhaps negotiate on the price or other conditions. And not normally where the landlord has, where the vendor has given rent holiday to the tenants, those are recoverable by you on settlement. What I mean is this: so if they have a new lease, they have given 6 months rent-free rent holiday to the tenants, then during your due diligence investigation process, you would ask for that 6 months rent to be credited to you on settlement. There are things like building warrant of fitness that you have to look for, and if it's like industrial, then you look at the planning, zoning at the council, whether resource consent has been granted. So there are actually quite a lot of considerations to make. For example, with the work that are going on in the city, Albert Street, you want to know what sort of works are being carried on in the vicinity. How would it affect your tenant? Is it likely to cause a disrepute between you and your tenants? Will they ask for compensation? There is a quiet enjoyment clause in the deed of lease that provides that the tenants have to have quiet enjoyment. And with that in mind, I think the world is your oysters. Go out there, have a look at the kinds of commercial properties that are available, seek the right tax advice, and have your legal structure set up properly before you go ahead and buy something. Yep, just go for it. And with this, I will finish my webinar and pass on to Blandon. Before I do, if you've got any questions, just feel free to email me, give me a call. I'm quite happy to talk to you on a no obligations basis. If you've got any preliminary questions, and we'll just wait for Blandon to come on.
Yep, I'm ready, but I need to. I can't share screen or activate my camera. Oh yeah, here we go. Whew. All right. Can you guys see my screen? Good. All right. So thanks for staying on. I know it's good weather out there today, so appreciate you guys' time and your attention. So today, with commercial property, I think a lot of the time, it's very easy for us to just like look at property for the sake of looking at properties. But I think in terms of how commercial property fit in your portfolio is to actually generate more cash flow. And it's a lot more predictable in terms of cash flow on commercial property than it is with residential, because you tend to have a lease, that's signed on for several years. And usually you have a net yield, you have a net figure on the income, opposed to in a residential property, a lot of the ongoing costs might be on the landlord, whereas commercial, as Alistair indicated, it could be passed on to the tenants. So I'm going to focus on how you could potentially position your portfolio in a way where you can generate another $50,000 quite easily without really sacrificing too much on the capital gain side of things, or changing your portfolio too significantly, but just to generate a lot more cash flow. So just a reminder for everybody, there are 3 types of property portfolios that we can build. And the first one is what we call all cash, no gains. And simply put is, perhaps you have dabbled into properties, you a little bit scared, so you bought something really, really cheap because you thought their cash flow might be like an apartment or something. It might be like a regional property that is in a non-population, not much growth area. And so if you had an emergency and you had to sell your investment assets, you don't actually have too much capital to play with. So that's what we call an all cash, no gains. But if anyone bought their investment in Auckland, I would very doubt that you're in this position here, or unless you're just perhaps just buying leaseholds or just straight apartments, you might not have as much capital gains. The second type is lazy capital. So this is when you bought, 1 or 2 property that you have bought a few years back, and you didn't really bother to do anything with it. And the rent is sort of just covering the expenses. You're not really sitting on like 150 or 200K net cash flow. You might have $200,000 in rent, but you certainly don't have $2,000 in net cash flow. And so you've got a ton of equity that the bank is saying, hey, you don't have any servicing, and this is what we call lazy capital. The ideal scenario is to be in what we call a lean, mean cash flow machine. Got a picture of Michael Jordan here. He's athletic. He's really good at everything that he does, and this guy's very agile, and he can fly. So what is a lean, mean cash flow machine? Basically, if you're in this position, the bank's not going to be able to say no to you. You've got passive income that's going to allow you to finance a Lamborghini if you want, send your kids to private school, buy your parents trips every year, guilt-free cruises, and actually quit your 9 to 5. So in a position where you can make those decisions to just, because money is just coming in like a printing machine. So with commercial, right, what happens is it's not for everybody. And how I see it is that you want to be in a high equity position as a minimum, because what happens is if you're looking to leverage, you're going to find yourself being stuck really early on if you're just building straight from commercial property, because the terms are a lot different. Even though cash flow might be slightly higher, the terms go from 25 years to 15 years a lot of the time, meaning the bank is not going to lend you as much money. So you really want to be in a high equity position where you can sort of mitigate through by putting more cash into the deal. So in this little graph here, you'll be in this position where you've got at least high cash flow and high equity, or just high equity, perhaps low cash flow, and you're wanting to build more cash flow from commercial properties. Okay, so I'm going to share 3 mortgage hacks with you. And the first one is the one thing that differentiates the astute investor from the favored investors, okay? And then the second one is the unfair advantage of commercial property. That's going to instantly generate another $50,000 net. And then also how you can increase your borrowing capacity, even though the bank might have already said no. So a little bit about Mortgage HQ. If you guys have not been in the last two webinars, we specialize in mortgages and most of the time for investors. And we believe people can make mortgage their asset builder. And what that basically means is how we can help clients, build the confidence and be comfortable to use debt as a tool to build their wealth. So MHQ would be very lucky. We've got a young team, a team of 30 at the moment. And in the last 5 years, including this year, we were named top advisors by New Zealand Advisors. So we've done over $1 billion in mortgages, and yeah, I think maybe like 1,700 clients nationwide now. So yeah, a bit of experience through volume, maybe not our age, but definitely through volume. So mortgage hack number one, the one thing that differentiates astute investor from favored investor, and that one thing is that the astute investor have a clear exit strategy. And so what is an exit strategy? So a lot of the time when you build a portfolio, a lot of people just say, oh, I want to build 10 property in 10 years. But what they might fail to remember is that, the number of properties is only a means to an end, because at the end of the day, you're trying to build a lifestyle. You're trying to have enough cash flow so that you can do the things that's important to you without really thinking twice about it. Or, just stop working in general and have that cash flow coming in and not have to dig into the capital. So exit strategy is a contingency plan that's executed by an investor, okay? So you might consider liquidating, you might be disposing some of the assets, but it's all about hitting a predetermined criteria. And what does that look like in property? So liquidation might mean you're selling down your portfolio to cash out, recapitalization, reducing your debt levels through other reallocations. So you might be selling down and then putting some of that money into other assets that's going to have higher cash flow, or maybe you're looking at lower risk. Because if you talk to any really wealthy people, what happens is as they grow their portfolio or their assets grow, they're actually just looking for something that has steady returns with less volatility. So you might want to recapitalize your position. And then third one is you could potentially look at trading yields, and simply put is selling some of your lower yielding assets, lower performing assets, and going for much higher cash flow assets. And if you guys actually want to learn more on just particularly on how you could trade assets, on how clients have, gone from like a 2 mil equity position to 200K passive income, we have a webinar on our website on mhq.co.nz. If you just look under education, and what happens is there's a webinar, the 60-minute webinar will have a lot more in it and about trading yields. So an example of an exit strategy, get to 2 mil equity position and reinvest the capital, liquidate and recapitalize, and expect a 10% cash on cash return to generate $200,000 passive income. So cash on cash return is quite important when you are trying to push your position towards cash flow, okay? Less important when you're just trying to bulk up, like so to speak. When you're trying to build up your portfolio, first of all, it's just to build up enough capital first. And in that position, you're just trying to maximize your leverage safely, getting the most cash flow possible. But when you're trying to dial down and rejig your portfolio, cash on cash return is one of the most important metric. And I'm not going to dive too much into cash on cash return here. If it's something new to you, you should write it down as homework for you guys to Google what cash on cash return is. Okay, so you can actually check out Stage 3 Masterclass. That's going to actually explain that a lot more. Okay, so in summary, capital gains make you rich, but cash flow is what truly liberates you and allows you to have those financial position. And this is a question that I want you guys to reflect on. If you guys are still here listening, if you guys are building a portfolio, right, what is your free cash flow goal? How much free cash flow would you like from your portfolio? Instead of trying to aim for a certain amount of properties, how much cash flow do you want to aim for? Just write that down, okay? And so, you know, you don't really want to be in a position where you're stressed about the debt because you're just constantly just chasing, right? Chasing, you know, trying to pay for your next mortgage repayment. Because a lot of people's portfolio, when they come to us, they might be in that position where there's a lot of equity, but it's just not a whole bunch of cash flow, and they don't have much flexibility with the banks. And they're always told that they're maxed out, still work 9 to 5 to service their portfolio, and that's not where we want to be in. The position where we want to be in is a lean, mean cash flow machine. And the most important thing is just defining that portfolio net profit goal, and then we can reverse engineer on how to rejig, reshuffle your portfolio to get the cash flow out of it. So one way you could do this is through commercial property. And this is a little trick you can do to generate you another $50,000 net, okay? And so this is the interesting thing about commercial property. Now, the basics of commercial property is that you can get up to 65% LVR. You have to put down a 35% deposit. The rates are going to be higher. So 3 to 5% at the moment is risk-based, but you know, I would say 3.5 is probably a starting point now with the interest rate changes, closer to 4% now. And the terms are 15 years usually, or depending on what the lease term might be. And with residential equity, there's a hack for you, right? Because what happens is if you've got a residential portfolio with a lot of equity, you can actually access that equity to buy commercial property. So instead of paying a commercial interest rate, you can use the equity on your residential property and get interest rate at 2.5%, 3%. Well, actually 2.5 is gone now. The interest rate gone up again just this week. So I need to update this. But the terms is also much easier to deal with. You're not paying principal and interest. You're paying interest only over 25-year loan term. So that means you are using, you've got a lot less cash flow going out. So if you're using leverage, the interest rate is lower and the terms are much easier to service. So that means you're getting a much higher cash flow coming from commercial. So straight away, you can just sort of imagine in your head, if you could just swap one of your residential for commercial, you could actually get a lot more cash flow out of it. And I'm going to demonstrate to you on paper what that looks like. So a Remuera unit versus the Wary industrial that Alistair was showing us. So how does the cash sort of compare when we compare units, you know, like a retirement unit or like, I guess, an investment property that you could use as retirement or Wary industrial. So let's have a look at the numbers here. First of all, you've got your total cost of the unit is around 1.08 million, and the commercial property was around 1.08 as well. Okay, so the mortgage required, let's say it's around the same amount that we're looking for, and so the cash that we have to put in is around 320,000. Okay, and so the final mortgage position is around the same. The annual gross rent is where the difference is. So the Wary property starts at 50,000. It's not even considering the fact that with the renovations, they up the rent to 65,000. Okay, so you can already see the gross rent is a lot higher on the commercial property, but the net income is where the massive difference is, because with the Remuera property, you're likely to have to pay for your own rates and the insurance, etc. Whereas Wary property, you don't have those expenses. So both have around $20,000 in if you use your residential equity to service to get the loan, then it's around 20,000 to service the mortgage. So you're getting a lot more net cash flow out of the commercial property. So if you look on a cash on cash basis, that's basically your net income divided by your total cost. Your net income divided by your total cost. You can see, your net income divided by the cash invested. Sorry, guys. Your net income divided by this 320K figure here. That means you put in 320K, this 320K is getting you 1.3%, whereas this 320K you put in the Wary property on a cash flow basis, you're getting closer to 10%. Okay, and not to mention that you also have the tax deductibility factor in there. So commercial property is going to be a lot stronger in that sense. Okay, so you got the gross yield. It's not that much difference, but you can see on a cash basis, it's a massive difference. And mortgage coverage, this is a measure of how much cash flow you have to service the debt. And you have a lot more cash flow coming in to service the debt. And then also on a net yield basis, you're getting a much higher figure. So all in all, cash flow is going to be much stronger on this Wiri industrial. Okay, and again, with the tax position, remember, this is considering everything. You can see sort of up here with the Remuera property, you've got all the rates, insurance, maintenance, consultant, property management, whereas a lot of the time with the commercial property, you might be able to pass on a lot of those costs to your tenants. Okay, so with tax deductibility, you actually add another 6,200 difference. That's why there's a massive discrepancy between like an existing property and a commercial property in this scenario. But of course, in saying that, there are a lot of residential property that have a lot more higher cash flow, and I think it's you know, I'm talking for majority of mum and dad, they might just buy a unit or something like that. But you know, if you really dive into residential, it can get quite interesting on what you could potentially do and the kind of cash flow you can achieve through residential as well. Okay, so what about capital gains? So what, you know, a lot of people might be scared to sell their property and buy a new one, right? Because they're like, well, you know, I'm always told to hold my property. I don't want to trade my Auckland property for, you know, commercial property because I've done really well in residential. So it kind of leads us into the next segment, which is how to increase your borrowing capacity. Even the bank have already said no. Because what if I could show you a way where, you know, you could trade the Remuera property for 2 additional property instead of just holding that one, because it would be a no-brainer, even if it was a lower capital gain. So this is what this is actually going to dive into. So most of the experienced investors that come to us, right, they always have a spreadsheet. I start the conversation by saying, hey, look, send me your spreadsheet and we can have a look at what we can do. And they always have some sort of spreadsheet here like this, sort of outlining, you know, what their rental incomes are, how much they purchased it for, how much debt they have. And as you can see, this is like someone who's more experienced. They built up a $7.5 million portfolio. They still got 3.3 million in mortgages. And they got annual rental income of 250K. Now that looks like a huge figure, but when you think about, when you consider all of the expenses, Mr. and Mrs. Lee don't actually have that much cash flow remaining, okay? And they also have this equity that's available, 2.7 million, that they can't actually access. Is not really doing much work, even though the bank would lend it to them. This is, of course, accounting for 80%. This is based on using a non-bank lender, but you know, even at 60%, we still have more than $1 million of available equity that we can't use. So how much can Mr. and Mrs. Lee borrow, even though they have this much equity? Okay, so this is a typical scenario of a borrowing calculation. Okay, so you got 2 applicants, you know, you've got your fixed commitment. This is actually going to be a huge factor going forward with the servicing calculation. Actually, all the banks have started implementing new rules under the new triple CFA regime. Basically, it's just to make sure responsible lending. That's basically the summary of it. You know, being responsible to our clients, really deep diving into the expenses instead of just using like a average figure. They're going to really look into your bank statement and understand what you're spending, your outgoings are. So it's really important that, you know, you try to keep track of things. And you know, if you're spending the less regular commitments you have, the better it is for your servicing calculation. Say, for example, like even childcare expense, for example, if you guys are listening, and childcare expense is a huge one. And if you could say grandma's paying for it and it's not coming out of your account, it actually increases your borrowing capacity quite a bit. Okay. And so you have income to factor in, like 110,000, 55,000 here. You've got the rental income of 4,800. And then the third most important thing is the rental, the mortgage, right? And this is where the biggest discrepancy is, because when people calculate their own calculation, they're like, okay, well, I'm only paying 3%. I'm actually cash flow positive. The bank should lend me more money. But the bank is actually going to stress test this at a much higher interest rate, because they don't think interest rates always going to stay this low. So they're going to stress test this closer to 6%. And now, actually, when we factor everything in, there isn't any money left over, and Mr. and Mrs. Lee can't actually borrow more money. Okay. So how can we change this position, right? Because you've got all of this equity, 2.7 if we use the non-bank, 1.3 if we use the main bank. How could we change? How could we access this? How could we get most return from this? Because if you got 2.7 mil, you can actually buy up to 13 mil of properties, 9 to 13 mil quite easily. This is what we call lazy capital, right? It's not doing the work it should. It's not giving the cash flow that Mr. and Mrs. Lee deserve. Okay, so here's a second hack with the commercial, right? Okay, if a residential property, you're getting $950 in rents, what happens is the bank's going to use 75% of this to service the loan. So that means the net usable income to service a loan is $712, okay? Whereas if it's a commercial property of $950 rents coming in, the bank is actually willing to use up to 95%. So that means for servicing, you've got an extra $200 in servicing income. That's actually equates to around $200,000, just under 100. Yeah, about just around $200,000 extra in borrowing. So that means if you could use residential equity to buy commercial, you actually end up with more servicing power. Okay, so equivalent to, if you've got $950 in rent in commercial, it's equivalent to buying a residential property of $1,200 in rental income, which is great for servicing. Okay, in simpler terms, 5% net in commercial is going to be the same as buying like a residential on 6.33 gross yield on the residential. Okay. So what if Mrs. Lee and Mr. and Mrs. Lee swap a property for commercial with 5% yield? So let's see what the implication looks like if we just added one commercial property into Mr. and Mrs. Lee's situation. So we've got a low performing asset here. Maybe it's a land bank, maybe it's something that they just it's got a bit of land, but they're just not willing to develop it because they're getting old, and they'd rather not take that risk and pass it on to someone else. They could sell it, swap it for something else. That might be something they might prefer. And a lot of the time, it is the truth for a lot of people. They shouldn't be trying to go in and do like a 7-lot development. It's not as easy as what people think, right? So we've got this low performing asset here. It's only yielding 2.9%. And so what if we could swap this for a residential property of 6.3, like 5% yield, which is a gross yield of 6.33. Now our rental income actually have increased from 4,870 down here up to 6,151. So basically we swapped 2 million for 2 million of commercial properties. So what does that do to Mr. and Mrs. Lee's borrowing capacity? Okay, it actually increases it by a significant amount to 750,000, right? And this is even before considering the future rental income of the next property that they buy. So simply by swapping a lower yielding asset, not only have they increased their cash flow position, they actually freed up some borrowing capacity of 750,000. And so what could they do, right? They could actually buy another property, maybe a home and income that has 1,100 for 1.3 million. This could be something in Manariwa potentially. 1.3, you could potentially achieve 1,100 rent. And so, now let me ask you, right? Like basically you're swapping two of these, like you're swapping a unit like this. So basically 2 mil, because we had 2 mil to play with. So we're swapping 2 of these units for 2 weary properties plus a home and income. So that's the end position. By swapping just one property, you can add a significant amount of leverage and cash flow into the portfolio. So before and after, if we just simplify it, so before the commercial property, the net cash flow for Mr. and Mrs. Lee after all the expenses, is around 47,000. With interest rate going up, it's probably less now because interest rate's gone up by like about 0.3% on average. But after the commercial, they could actually add more cash flow, by just doing that swap. They've got 105,000, and that's not even including the new potential property that they may buy of 1.3 million. If they could buy a net cash, like a net positive cash flow property, they could potentially add more passive income into their portfolio. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of how you could utilize commercial property in your portfolio, because the result is higher leverage, higher cash flow. Okay. And so if you guys want to learn more, just definitely check out our YouTube channel on MHQ, Mortgage HQ. You can search that on YouTube. This should be a lot of free information there. And also we've got a Facebook group called MHQ Nation. And if you want to talk to somebody, definitely take action. So Mortgage Action Plan, you can just send an email to me, blandon@mhq.co.nz. If you forget and don't remember, just remember mhq.co.nz. You'll find my email address on the website. And then what will happen is our team will actually get you to complete a MHQ profile. So it's just to understand your financial position. And then you get a free mortgage strategy session with one of our advisors. And depending on how complex your situation is, we'll make sure that, we're assigned an advisor that's going to be capable to look after you. So that's it from me. I appreciate you guys' attention and time. And if you guys have any questions, I think I'm going to pass it on to Connie for a Q&A.
Thanks very much, Blandon. Yeah, so we are now open for questions and answer session. Feel free to for your queries in the Q&A or the chat box, or even feel free to unmute yourself and we can have a more engaging discussion verbally. So either way works. I know that we had a few queries throughout the webinar, so shall I maybe start off with repeating those questions, and then maybe that could be of interest to other people as well? Shall I, as a start, while waiting for other people putting in the query? So Sue was asking, what is the process to convert a residential property to commercial property? For example, from tenant to daycare.
It depends on the zoning of your property and whether you're able to do so. But assuming you're able to do so, you'd apply for a resource consent and building consent from the Auckland Council, and then you'd be able to take it from there.
Yeah, Bibiana, I think this one was already zoned for mixed use, mixed commercial. So just the
right. Yeah. Okay. All right. In that case, then I suppose it's just converting the building into a daycare, and then getting a tenant, getting the deed of lease drawn up to reflect the terms and conditions of the tenancy. Normally with the daycare, the resource consent will set out what sort of numbers are allowed, what terms and conditions are required for renovating the property from a residential to the daycare.
Cool, thanks, Bibiana. Alistair, did you
comment on that, if that's all right?
Certainly.
We actually sold a warehouse recently that had been converted to a daycare centre. So yeah, it was in industrial zoning, but it was had the resource consent for childcare, and it was completely fitted out for childcare. And you touched on it, Bibiana. So commercial leases, they often require the tenant to strip the place back out to what it was looking like when they first took possession. So this warehouse we sold, while it was fitted out as a childcare centre and really, really well, part of the terms of the lease were in the event that that childcare business vacates, they need to strip all that fit out back out at their cost and turn it back into the warehouse it was when they took possession.
Make good is a very common clause in the deed of lease, isn't it? So making good by the tenant. Cool. Next question from Eddie. How do you achieve 25 years interest only? That's for Blandon.
Very easy. So max interest only term is 5 years, but you can refinance every 5 years.
I see. There's a tip for the day.
So
For,
if you need finance, hit me up. I love refinance.
Question from Chi. There was a from the Q&A. What can be done to improve the capital gains and or yield of the commercial property? I know Alice have answered it, but I think it would be good. Maybe some other people might be interested in that answer to that question, Alistair.
Oh, is that answer not visible to everyone? Is it?
I
guess I
not
talked
sure.
through. Yeah, I talked through some examples in my prezzo. So. Yeah, often just giving the place a little birthday can add a lot of rent and therefore add a lot of value. And honestly, liquor paint, LED lights go a long way to making the property just aesthetically look better. And if your property looks better than the competitor properties on the leasing market, you'll be able to get higher rent and or rent quicker. Yeah, there's all sorts of. We've seen investors add several $100,000 to a warehouse simply by replacing some tension ties in the framing for the cost of around $30,000, for example. So, the more experience you get, the more you talk to people, learn, the better you'll get at identifying opportunities. I mean, we've got one in Howick at the moment, for example, where there is a tenant who is extremely unhappy with their landlord. They've been in business for 15, 20 years there. They want to relocate. So we're working with them to relocate them into a similar size premises, literally 2 shops down the road. But they don't want to pay for any fit out. And the landlord of that property doesn't want to pay for any fit out. But they also open to selling. So we're looking to match an investor to the property with the tenant with a backup lease behind it, looking for an investor with 20, 30,000, whatever it's going to cost to fit that place out. And it's a great way to add value. And if you've got the ability to withstand paying the loan while you don't have tenant income, you can pick up commercial properties a lot cheaper than you could if they're tenanted. So you can get a pretty decent discount buying commercial properties vacant and then putting the tenant in there, as opposed to picking it up ready to go and already generating income.
Oh, thanks, Alistair. Ian's query is, with the upside of commercial compared to residential, wouldn't it make more sense for people to start with commercial directly instead of starting with residential and then swapping to commercial?
Yeah, I think that's one for Blandon.
Finances.
Upside of commercial compared to residential. The upside that I'm showing today is the upside from commercial is if you have a ton of residential equity that you can use the equity at residential rates to buy commercial property. So then you're getting the upside of the cash flow in commercial, but you're getting the residential loan terms. So like I saw another question earlier, which is another person that mentioned if you had commercial property, the cash flow, in his experience, David J said, in his experience, commercial has higher yield, but due to reduced loan terms on commercial, higher interest rate, all the extra yield is tied up in the mortgage repayment, hence not is free cash flow. So he's exactly right. That's the exact reason why I mentioned right from the beginning, from my observation, commercial property is suitable for someone in a more established capital equity position, where they have a lot more cash on hand that they can, and potential maybe some even freehold residential property that they can use the equity to buy commercial property, so that they're going to get the maximum cash flow out of it. Does that answer the question, Connie? You think?
Yeah, is that, I think, David, are you happy with the answer? Do you have any other questions to add to that? Oh, good. Okay, cool. Next question is from TW. Hi, Blandon and Connie. If I develop my land into 10 tiers houses and keep, will bank consider it as commercial? Can I claim the tax? Do you want to go first, Blandon, or do you want me to go?
Yeah, like simply put, if you've got 10 residential property on 10 separate titles, it's just a residential portfolio that has, 10 properties, right? So you can get residential rates, but some banks are a little bit more conservative, because what happens is if you get to a certain size in terms of lending, or if you have certain amount of properties in the same location, they call it a concentrated risk, so that they might start charging you different rates. So yes, you can probably get residential rates, very likely, unless you're building something that has a commercial component. There's no reason why you can't get residential rates. Unless your 10 properties are on one title, then very likely that's going to be looked at as commercial.
And from the tax point of view, because so TW is trying to develop and then keep these property and rent it out, because renting out for long-term accommodation is a GST exempt activity. So there shouldn't be any GST that can be claimed during the development, and there's no GST to return because when it's after it's developed and it's rented out. So IRD wouldn't allow for any GST to be claimed because of the develop and keep strategy, and that you're providing a GST exempt supply at the end of the development. And in terms of income tax side, you'll need to, most of the costs will be capitalized during the development because you're holding it on a capital account. But after the, after the development, when you get rental income, then that's subject to income tax, and then you have to return that rental income, residential rental income in the income tax return of whichever entity you decide to develop it under. So I hope that explains. So in summary, no, you can't really claim GST, and also for income tax, you're likely to capitalize most of the development costs because you're holding it on capital account, not revenue. David J. Another question from David J is that he said, my question above about commercial property cash flow, and add, or is that only in the circumstances where are you borrowing on residential property and used to purchase commercial? And confirming the money you borrowed on the residential property and is used to buy commercial is tax deductible residential. I'm a bit confused about your question, David. Would you mind maybe, I think I know what you're getting at with the text part, but I'm not entirely sure with maybe the top two part. Perhaps if I just answer the text part, and then if you can maybe, if you like to retype your question, and then we can allocate your query to the appropriate presenter. So what I understand is that with the text side, your query is, if you were to borrow or leverage your residential property to buy commercial property, would that tax be deductible? Would the interest would still be deductible under the new interest limitation rule? I'm guessing that's what you mean. Again, I think it's currently the rules with the new interest limitation rule has yet to be finalized. But my understanding is that if you're leveraging residential property for business purposes, my understanding that is still deductible, because that is for you borrowing the loan for business purposes. For commercial property, I'm suspecting it's possible, but again, because the law hasn't been finalized, I don't want to put any guarantee to it without, I think, the law being passed yet. So I'm suspecting it's possible, but I'm not 100% sure with that one. Okay, I'm seeing.
Connie, because if I ask you a question, right? Because what happens is, just because we leverage off the equity of the residential property, right? Yeah. When we raise that fund, when we raise that money, where the purpose of it is to buy the commercial property. So it doesn't matter if that property is raised from the equity on the residential property, right? It's when we took out that loan, the purpose of that loan is to do the commercial. So therefore, that should be 100% tax deductible, right?
That's my that's my expectation. Until the law is passed, I can't 100% confirm, but that's what I'm expecting to be the outcome. Because otherwise it wouldn't make sense if it allows for business purposes, but not for commercial property investment purposes. So yeah, that's my expectation. Yes. Sorry, going David. Okay. I'll just wait till David J rephrases the question, and then I'll move on to the next one. I can come back, David. Dave Tetterfield is asking, usual path for investor is to start with residential as it takes less deposits to start with. Is the entry point for, okay, that's not, okay, that's a comment, not a question. Okay. Okay. Joseph, question for Blandon. Is the borrowing rule different if it was a mixed residential and commercial property?
It's just a commercial property, so. Yeah.
Chi, another question for you, Blandon, from Chi. Can the commercial property loan be refinanced with another bank to extend the 15-year mortgage period?
Just depends on what the lease look like. I mean, it's the risk profile, right? But generally speaking, yes, if it's freehold, commercial property.
Cool. Sue is asking, selling a residential property to buy commercial property, tax implications, please. So I think the first question is, when you sell the residential property, we have to consider, does it fall within any of the land taxing provision and whether any of the exemption apply. So we need to understand when you purchase the residential property, and then what is the purpose it's currently used for, so we can advise what is the whether there's any income tax implication for the residential property. The GST is unlikely to apply much because it's residential property, and then buying the commercial property. It is coming down. There's no tax implication in terms of buying commercial property, but as I mentioned in the presentation, there is different tax, GST and income tax treatment for commercial property. And then say later down the track, you sell the commercial property, we can then further advise if any of the land taxing provision applies and whether any of the exemption applies. So yeah, so we can further advise when you come to the time when you do sell the properties, because we would prefer to provide timely tax advice. Then yeah. Okay, that's outside bright line. Yeah, okay, so adding on to your comments Stu, about if it's outside bright line. So bright line is only one of the section in the land taxing provision. So CB 6A talks about what the bright line test. There's other land taxing provisions such as CB 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 that we need to consider to ensure that it's not taxed under those other land taxing provision. Because if it is, then we need to consider if the other exemption and linking to those land taxing provision applies. So we need to consider your current background, whether you're a developer, subdivider, or are you in business in developing or subdividing or business relating to land, to see if you fall with any of those land taxing provision, because those land taxing provision also extends to people associated with you. So if you are associated with, developer, subdivider, or business, or people in business relating to land, then it could potentially capture the transaction into the tax net. So these are the details that I think I can give another presentation on the land taxing provision, but because of the limited time, I can't really go into detail. But I think in short is to seek tax advice before you sell. And then you're aware what sort of tax exposure you have or not. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Cool. Thanks, Sue. Cool. Thanks, David, for your kind words. I hope it's been useful and everyone's taken at least something out of it. And yeah, I think, is this everyone, all questions answered? Any last minute question before I conclude the webinar? Or any other comments from the presenters? Any final comments or tips for the attendees? Pleasure. All right, well, if there's no other question, I'll then just conclude the webinar, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And it's been a great session, really, I think, engaging at the end, and I think, yeah, very good feedback as well. So thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you in our future webinars, and enjoy the rest of the day. Very nice out there, and have a nice weekend, everyone.
See you all.
See ya.
Stay off the KFC.